In the autumn of 1823, the Ashford family moved into Ashford Manor, a sprawling estate nestled deep in the rolling hills of rural Virginia. The house had been built just 2 years prior by their patriarch, Cornelius Ashford, a man who had made his fortune in the tobacco trade and believed his wealth entitled him to anything he desired. Within 5 years, 3 of his children would be dead under mysterious circumstances. Within 10 years, his wife would vanish without a trace. And within 20 years, the Ashford name would become synonymous with a darkness so profound that locals refused to speak it aloud after sunset. But the horrors that unfolded within those walls went far deeper than simple tragedy. They revealed a pattern, a generational curse of violence and madness that had followed the Ashford bloodline for generations before anyone knew to look. Before we descend into the darkest corners of the Ashford legacy, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below, because what you are about to hear is one of the most sinister family histories ever documented in American history. This is Epic of Fear, where buried secrets refused to stay silent. Virginia in the early 1820s was a state defined by contrasts. On one hand, it was the birthplace of American democracy, home to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, a place where ideals of liberty and equality were written into the nation's founding documents. On the other hand, it was built entirely on slavery, its wealth and power sustained by the brutal exploitation of hundreds of thousands of enslaved people who had no rights, no legal protections, and no hope of freedom within their lifetimes. The plantation economy that dominated Virginia's landscape created a class of wealthy landowners who lived in extraordinary luxury, while those who produced that wealth lived in conditions of unspeakable deprivation. The Ashford family was among Virginia's wealthiest landowners, though their wealth had not always been legitimate or honorable. Cornelius Ashford had built his fortune through a combination of tobacco cultivation, land speculation, and activities that bordered on the criminal. He had been investigated twice by colonial authorities for suspected involvement in smuggling operations along the Chesapeake Bay, but never charged. He had acquired several of his land holdings through transactions that later investigations revealed to be fraudulent, taking advantage of families who had fallen into debt during the economic turmoil following the Revolutionary War. By 1823, Cornelius owned over 2,000 acres of prime Virginia farmland, employed 43 enslaved people, and had constructed Ashford Manor, a 17-room house that was one of the largest private residences in the county. The manor was built with imported materials, Italian marble for the entrance hall floors, French windows for the drawing room, mahogany woodwork throughout. It was designed to project wealth and power, to announce to anyone who saw it that the Ashford family had arrived at the pinnacle of Virginia society. Cornelius himself was a physically imposing man, over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a commanding presence that made smaller men uncomfortable. He had dark hair that turned gray early, giving him a distinguished appearance that concealed the cold calculation behind his eyes. He spoke softly, almost gently, but his words carried the weight of absolute authority. Those who worked for him, both enslaved and free, learned quickly that disagreement was not tolerated and that consequences for disobedience were swift and severe. His wife, Margaret Ashford, née Beaumont, was 20 years his junior, having married Cornelius at 17 in a transaction that was as much business arrangement as marriage. Her family had fallen into debt, and Cornelius had offered to clear their obligations in exchange for Margaret's hand. She was beautiful in the way of Southern aristocrats, pale-skinned with auburn hair and green eyes, educated in the refined arts expected of women of her class. But beneath the polished exterior, Margaret possessed a sharp intelligence and a quiet determination that Cornelius had not anticipated when he arranged the marriage. The Ashfords had 5 children when they moved into the manor. The eldest was Thomas, born in 1812, 11 years old at the time of the move. He was a serious, studious boy who spent hours reading and seemed more comfortable with books than with other children. Next came Eleanor, born in 1814, 9 years old, a spirited girl who challenged boundaries and frequently earned punishment for her rebellious behavior. Then came the twins, James and John, born in 1817, 6 years old, quiet boys who spent most of their time together and seemed to communicate without words in the way twins sometimes do. The youngest was Catherine, born in 1820, only 3 years old when the family moved to the manor, too young to remember any other home. It was Catherine who would become the central figure in the Ashford family's darkest chapter, though in 1823 she was simply a small girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark, watchful eyes. She would grow up in Ashford Manor, surrounded by wealth and beauty, and she would witness horrors that would shape the rest of her life and eventually destroy her family completely. The first deaths came in the winter of 1826, when the twins, James and John, contracted diphtheria during an epidemic that swept through the county. The disease was common and often fatal in the 1820s, killing thousands of children each year across America. Both boys fell ill simultaneously, as twins sometimes do when exposed to the same pathogen at the same time. Their symptoms progressed identically: high fever, sore throat, the characteristic membrane forming in the throat that could suffocate a child within days. Margaret nursed her sons personally, staying at their bedsides day and night, administering fluids and cool compresses and prayers. The family physician, Dr. Samuel Crawford, visited daily, prescribing the standard treatments of the era, which amounted to little more than bloodletting and various tonics that were more likely to harm than help. James died first, on December 14, 1826, suffocating when the membrane in his throat closed completely. John survived another 3 days, as if fighting to stay alive after his twin had gone. He died on December 17th in Margaret's arms, his small body finally surrendering to the disease. The loss of both twins devastated Margaret in ways that went beyond normal maternal grief. She had been close to both boys, spending hours with them each day, teaching them their letters and numbers, reading to them in the evenings. Their deaths removed something essential from her world, and the grief she experienced seemed to deepen rather than fade with time. She withdrew from social activities, rarely left her room, spoke to servants only when absolutely necessary. Cornelius, who had shown limited emotional investment in his children beyond their value as heirs, viewed his wife's grief as weakness and told her bluntly that she needed to recover and resume her duties. Margaret's withdrawal created a vacuum in the household that Cornelius filled with control. He began making decisions about everything, from the household budget to the education of the remaining children to the management of the enslaved population. He hired a governess for Thomas, Eleanor, and Catherine, a stern woman named Mrs. Adelaide Price, who enforced strict discipline and discouraged any emotional expression. The children were taught to be proper Southern aristocrats, to maintain composure in all situations, to never show weakness or vulnerability. Thomas, now 14, and the eldest surviving son, took on responsibility for his younger sisters with a maturity beyond his years. He studied diligently, hoping to inherit the family business and prove himself worthy of the Ashford name. Eleanor, now 12, became increasingly rebellious under the harsh regime of Mrs. Price and Cornelius's control. She sneaked books not approved for women, spent time with enslaved children, despite being told this was inappropriate, and questioned rules that she found unjust. Catherine, only 6, was still young enough to adapt to whatever environment she was placed in, but she observed everything with those dark, watchful eyes inherited from her father. In the spring of 1828, Eleanor began behaving strangely. She would disappear for hours, returning with dirt under her fingernails and leaves in her hair, unable or unwilling to explain where she had been. She started speaking in her sleep, carrying on conversations that no one else could hear. She drew pictures obsessively, filling page after page with the same image: a figure standing in a dark doorway, watching. When Margaret, rousing herself from grief long enough to notice her daughter's behavior, asked about the drawings, Eleanor became agitated and insisted that someone was watching the family, that she could see him sometimes, standing at the edge of the property where the forest began. Margaret dismissed Eleanor's claims as childhood fantasy, the product of a sensitive imagination combined with grief over her brother's deaths. But the enslaved people working at the manor told a different story. Several of them reported seeing a figure at the edge of the property, particularly at dusk, when the shadows lengthened and the forest seemed to press closer. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing, and it simply stood watching the house. When anyone approached, it retreated into the trees and disappeared. These sightings became common enough that the enslaved workers began refusing to go near the forest after dark. Cornelius dismissed the sightings as superstition, threatening punishment for any enslaved person who repeated such claims. But Dr. Crawford, who visited the family regularly, privately noted in his journal that he too had seen something at the edge of the property on 2 separate occasions, a shape that was there when he glanced sideways, but gone when he looked directly. He wrote that it might have been a trick of light or shadow, but that it left him with an uncomfortable feeling of being observed that lasted for hours afterward. The figure at the edge of the property became known among the enslaved workers as the Watcher. Stories about it spread through the slave quarters, growing more elaborate with each retelling. Some said it was the ghost of one of the twins, unable to rest because of how he had died. Others said it was something older, something that had inhabited the land before the Ashfords built on it, something that had been disturbed by the construction of the manor and was now observing the family that had invaded its territory. A few of the older enslaved women, who practiced traditional African spiritual beliefs alongside their Christian faith, said the Watcher was neither ghost nor spirit, but something else entirely, something that fed on the suffering it witnessed. Eleanor's behavior continued to deteriorate through the summer and autumn of 1828. She stopped sleeping, spending nights standing at her bedroom window, staring out toward the forest. She stopped eating, refusing food, and becoming visibly thinner over weeks. She spoke increasingly about the Watcher, insisting that it was communicating with her, sharing information about the family that no one else knew. Some of this information proved accurate, details about Cornelius's business dealings that Eleanor could not have known, predictions about events that subsequently occurred. Margaret, finally alarmed enough to act, brought a physician from Richmond to examine Eleanor, Dr. Nathaniel. Forsyth was one of Virginia's most respected alienists, specialists in mental illness, who were beginning to approach such conditions with something resembling scientific method rather than pure superstition. Dr. Forsyth spent 3 days at Ashford Manor, observing Eleanor carefully, conducting tests, interviewing family members. His conclusion was that Eleanor was experiencing a form of what he called moral insanity, a condition where the patient appeared physically healthy, but exhibited bizarre beliefs and behaviors that suggested profound psychological disturbance. He prescribed laudanum, the standard treatment for agitation and sleeplessness, and recommended that Eleanor be confined to her room to prevent her from wandering the grounds. Cornelius agreed immediately, and Eleanor was locked in her bedroom, with curtains drawn and a guard posted outside her door. The laudanum sedated her effectively, but it did not resolve the underlying condition. When the drug wore off, Eleanor resumed her strange behavior, her claims about the Watcher, her refusal to eat, her increasingly desperate insistence that something terrible was coming for the family. On November 3, 1828, Eleanor escaped from her room. The guard posted outside her door had fallen asleep, and Eleanor, who had stopped taking the laudanum by hiding it under her mattress, was fully alert and determined. She was found the next morning in the forest at the edge of the property, exactly where the Watcher had been seen standing. She was alive, but in a state of profound shock, unable to speak, her eyes wide and unfocused, her body curled into a fetal position, as if trying to protect herself from something. Eleanor never spoke again. She lived for another 2 years, existing in a vegetative state, fed by servants, cleaned and dressed by enslaved women who treated her with gentle care, despite the family's harsh attitude toward enslaved people. She showed no awareness of her surroundings, no response to stimuli, no sign that consciousness remained behind her open eyes. Margaret spent hours sitting with her daughter, holding her hand, speaking to her softly, hoping for some response that never came. Eleanor died in January of 1831, officially from pneumonia, though Margaret believed her daughter had simply decided to stop living after whatever she had seen in the forest. The death of Eleanor added to a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. 3 children dead or effectively destroyed within 5 years of the family moving to Ashford Manor. Margaret began to suspect that something was wrong with the house itself, or with the land it occupied, something that was harming her children in ways that went beyond normal illness or accident. She began researching the history of the property, consulting county records, and speaking with older residents who remembered the land before the Ashford family acquired it. What she discovered was disturbing. The land on which Ashford Manor had been built had belonged to several families before Cornelius purchased it, and each family had experienced significant tragedy during their time there. The Whitmore family, who owned the land from 1780 to 1795, lost 4 children to mysterious illnesses. The Henderson family, who owned it from 1795 to 1810, had their eldest son go mad at age 12 and spend the rest of his life institutionalized. 2 enslaved families on the property had experienced unexplained disappearances, members simply vanishing without trace. And before any white family owned the land, it had been considered sacred ground by the Powhatan people who had inhabited the region, a place where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world was said to be thin. Margaret shared these findings with Cornelius, urging him to sell the property and move the family elsewhere. Cornelius refused categorically. The manor was his greatest achievement, the symbol of everything he had built, and he would not abandon it because of superstitious fears based on unverified historical claims. He threatened Margaret with public humiliation if she continued to spread what he called shameful nonsense about their home. Margaret, trapped by her dependence on Cornelius and the social conventions that gave women virtually no independence, had no choice but to comply with his demands and continue living in a house she increasingly believed was destroying her family. Thomas, now 16 and the eldest surviving child, began to notice his mother's fear and the pattern she had identified. He was intelligent and perceptive, and the deaths of his brothers and sisters' destruction weighed heavily on him. He began his own research, reading everything he could find about the history of the property, about the nature of hauntings and spiritual disturbances, about ways to protect a family from supernatural threats. He did not share his research with his father, knowing Cornelius would dismiss it, but he kept detailed journals documenting his findings and his growing conviction that something malevolent inhabited the land. Catherine, now 8 years old, was developing in ways that concerned Margaret. The youngest Ashford child had inherited her father's observational nature, but combined it with a sensitivity that went beyond normal childhood perception. She claimed to see things that others could not, particularly the watcher at the edge of the forest. Unlike Eleanor, who had been frightened by the presence, Catherine seemed to communicate with it, standing at the window for hours, apparently engaged in silent conversation with something no one else could perceive. When Margaret asked Catherine about these conversations, the child responded with unsettling calm. She said the watcher was not evil but sad, that it had been here longer than any human being, that it watched the family because it was interested in them, particularly interested in Catherine herself. She said it told her things about the family, about what was going to happen, about secrets that adults kept hidden. Margaret was horrified by these claims, but could not determine whether Catherine was genuinely perceiving something or simply creating an elaborate fantasy to cope with the trauma of her siblings' deaths. The enslaved workers at the manor began to treat Catherine with a mixture of reverence and fear. They noticed that when Catherine was present, unusual things happened. Animals would gather near her, birds landing on her outstretched hands, horses following her without being led. Plants seemed to grow faster in areas where she played. Temperatures in rooms where she sat would drop noticeably, even in summer. The enslaved women who had practice in traditional spiritual beliefs believed Catherine was what they called a touch child, someone through whom spiritual forces could communicate and operate. In 1832, when Catherine was 12, Cornelius began exhibiting changes in his own behavior that alarmed everyone in the household. He had always been cold and calculating, but now he became erratic and unpredictable. He would fly into rages over trivial matters, punishing enslaved workers severely for minor infractions. He would disappear for days at a time, returning with no explanation for where he had been. He began sleeping less, spending nights walking the grounds, particularly near the forest where the watcher had been seen. Margaret noticed that Cornelius seemed to be drawn to the edge of the property, particularly at dusk. She watched him from an upstairs window one evening in October and saw him standing at the exact spot where the watcher had been reported, staring into the trees with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not fear or curiosity, but something like recognition, as if he was seeing something familiar, something he had encountered before. Dr. Crawford, who examined Cornelius at Margaret's request, found him physically healthy but psychologically disturbed. His pupils were often dilated, his pulse irregular, his skin cool to the touch even in warm weather. He exhibited signs of paranoia, believing that business rivals were spying on him, that the enslaved workers were planning rebellion, that even his own wife was conspiring against him. These beliefs had no basis in reality and represented a significant departure from Cornelius's previously rational, if cold, personality. The household descended into chaos through the winter of 1832 and 1833. Cornelius's behavior became increasingly erratic and violent. He dismissed Dr. Crawford, accusing the physician of poisoning him, and refused to see any other doctor. He began restricting the family's movements, confining Margaret and the children to specific rooms of the manor, posting enslaved workers as guards to prevent them from leaving. He stopped attending to business, letting correspondence pile unanswered, ignoring reports from his plantations that crops were failing and enslaved workers were fleeing. Thomas, now 20 and increasingly alarmed by his father's deterioration, attempted to reason with Cornelius, to suggest that he seek medical attention, to propose that the family leave the manor temporarily. Cornelius responded with fury, accusing his son of trying to steal the family fortune, threatening to disinherit him, and in one terrifying incident, attacking Thomas physically with a fireplace poker. Thomas was injured but survived, and from that point forward, he began making plans to protect his mother and sister from Cornelius's increasingly dangerous behavior. Catherine, meanwhile, continued her apparent communication with the watcher. She spent hours at the edge of the forest, sometimes visible to household members, sometimes disappearing into the trees entirely. When she returned, she would relay information about Cornelius's behavior that she could not possibly have known through normal means. She told Margaret that her father was being changed, that something was working on him, reshaping him from the inside, and that it would eventually consume him entirely if something was not done. Margaret asked Catherine what could be done. The 12-year-old child looked at her mother with eyes that seemed far older than 12 years, and said something that Margaret recorded in her diary that night. Catherine said, "The watcher is not our enemy, Mother. It is trying to warn us. Father brought something with him when he built this house, something from his past. The land amplifies it, makes it stronger. The watcher has been trying to tell us this for years, but no one listened until Eleanor. And Eleanor listened too late." Margaret pressed Catherine for more information. What had Cornelius brought? What was consuming him? Catherine said she did not fully understand, but that the watcher showed her images, fragments of Cornelius's past, that revealed something Margaret did not know. Cornelius had not simply made his fortune in tobacco and land speculation. He had been involved in darker activities, activities that had brought him into contact with people and beliefs that went beyond normal commerce or even simple criminality. In the weeks that followed, Thomas conducted his own investigation, reading through his father's private correspondence and business records that he accessed while Cornelius was in one of his fugue states, staring at nothing for hours. What Thomas found confirmed Catherine's claims and revealed the full scope of his father's involvement in activities that explained both his wealth and the darkness that had followed the family to Ashford Manor. Cornelius Ashford had not built his fortune through conventional means. In addition to tobacco cultivation and land speculation, he had been a participant in a network of wealthy Virginia landowners who practiced occult rituals believed to enhance agricultural fertility and personal power. These rituals drew on a mixture of European esoteric traditions and beliefs borrowed from enslaved Africans who understood natural forces and spiritual power in ways European science did not acknowledge. The rituals involved blood offerings, typically from enslaved people who would not be missed, and ceremonies conducted on specific dates aligned with agricultural cycles. Cornelius had been initiated into this network in 1815, before his marriage to Margaret, and had participated in numerous rituals over the following years. The rituals had indeed produced results, at least in terms of Cornelius's personal fortunes. His business dealings prospered, his land acquisition succeeded, his reputation grew. But the rituals also left marks on those who participated, psychological and spiritual scars that deepened with each ceremony. Over years of participation, Cornelius had been gradually changed, his moral capacity eroding, his connection to normal human empathy withering. When Cornelius built Ashford Manor on land that was already spiritually charged, the combination of his personal corruption and the land's unusual properties created an amplification effect. The darkness that Cornelius carried was magnified by the land, projected outward, affecting everyone who lived on the property. The deaths of the twins could be attributed to normal disease, but their unusual severity and the simultaneous nature of their illness suggested that something had enhanced the pathogen's lethality. Eleanor's destruction was less easily explained by natural causes, and Cornelius's own deterioration was the most direct evidence that something was consuming him from within. Thomas shared his discoveries with Margaret in January of 1833. Mother and son spent hours going through the documents Thomas had found, piecing together the full history of Cornelius's involvement in the occult network. Margaret was horrified, but not entirely surprised. She had sensed for years that Cornelius harbored secrets, that his cold calculation and lack of empathy went deeper than simple personality traits. Now she understood that her husband had actively participated in murder and ritual corruption that had gradually transformed him into something barely human. They discussed their options. Fleeing the manor would provide immediate safety, but would not address the underlying problem. Cornelius, wherever he went, carried the corruption with him, and it might follow the family regardless of location. Exposing his activities to authorities was impossible. The network he belonged to included powerful men who would destroy anyone who threatened to reveal their secrets. Fighting the corruption directly, attempting to break whatever hold the rituals had on Cornelius, seemed like the only option that might actually resolve the situation. But neither Thomas nor Margaret knew how to do this. Catherine provided the answer. The 12-year-old girl, who had been communicating with the Watcher for years, said that she understood what needed to be done. The Watcher, whatever it was, had existed on this land for centuries before any human being arrived. It was not evil, though it was not benevolent either. It was simply powerful, a force of nature that responded to the spiritual energies present on the land. It had been trying to help the Ashford family by alerting them to the danger Cornelius represented, and it could help them further if the family was willing to accept its assistance. What Catherine proposed was disturbing and unprecedented. She said the Watcher could help purge the corruption from Cornelius, essentially burning out the dark spiritual residue that the rituals had deposited in him over years. But the process would be painful, possibly fatal, and it would require Cornelius's cooperation, or at least his presence. He would need to be brought to the edge of the forest at midnight on the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, when the boundary between the living and spirit worlds was at its thinnest. Margaret and Thomas debated this plan extensively, concerned about relying on a force they did not understand and could not control. Catherine insisted that the Watcher was trustworthy, that it had protected the family in ways they did not know, and that without its intervention, Cornelius would continue to deteriorate until he was completely consumed by the corruption and became a danger to everyone around him. She said that the Watcher had already saved her life on 2 occasions when the corruption in Cornelius had threatened to spread to his children through proximity. On December 21st, 1833, the winter solstice, Thomas and Margaret carried out Catherine's instructions. Cornelius, in one of his dissociative states, was led without resistance to the edge of the forest at midnight. Catherine accompanied them, walking ahead of the group with a confidence and certainty that seemed impossible for a 13-year-old child. The night was cold and clear, the stars brilliant overhead, the forest absolutely silent in the way that only deep wilderness can be. What happened at the edge of the forest on that December night was witnessed by Thomas, Margaret, and Catherine, and described in Thomas's journal entries from the following days. The Watcher manifested fully for the first and only time, emerging from the trees as a figure of absolute darkness, taller than any human being, its form shifting and flowing like smoke given solid shape. It did not speak in words, but communicated through impressions that the witnesses felt directly in their minds, a sense of ancient awareness and calm authority that was simultaneously terrifying and reassuring. The Watcher approached Cornelius, who had been standing motionless, staring at nothing. As the dark figure drew close, Cornelius suddenly became aware, his eyes focusing for the first time in weeks. He looked at the Watcher, and his face showed pure recognition, as if he were seeing something he had encountered before in his darkest moments. Then he screamed, a sound of absolute terror that came from somewhere deeper than his throat, somewhere in his chest or his soul. What followed took approximately 1 hour, according to Thomas's account, though it felt like much longer. The Watcher seemed to reach into Cornelius, not physically, but in some other way that Thomas could not adequately describe. Cornelius convulsed, screamed, collapsed to the ground, his body contorting in ways that human bodies should not be able to move. Dark substance seemed to emerge from his skin, his eyes, his mouth, a viscous fluid that steamed in the cold air and evaporated before it could be collected or examined. When it was over, Cornelius lay on the ground, unconscious but breathing. The Watcher withdrew back into the forest, its form dissolving into the shadows until it was indistinguishable from the trees. Catherine stood perfectly still, watching the darkness where the figure had been, her expression calm and knowing. Margaret rushed to her husband, touching his face, finding his skin warm for the first time in months. Thomas knelt beside his father, checking his pulse, finding it steady and regular in a way it had not been for a year. They carried Cornelius back to the manor and put him to bed. He remained unconscious for 3 days. When he awoke on December 24th, Christmas Eve, he was a different man. Not in appearance, he still looked like the same tall, gray-haired patriarch he had always been. But something fundamental had changed in him. The coldness that had defined his personality for as long as anyone could remember was gone, replaced by something that almost resembled warmth, or at least the absence of cruelty. Cornelius spent the following weeks in a state of confused recovery, struggling to remember what had happened to him, what he had done, what had been done to the family while the corruption controlled him. When the memories came, they came with devastating clarity. He remembered participating in the rituals. He remembered the murders. He remembered the way the darkness had gradually taken hold of him, offering power in exchange for pieces of his humanity that he had surrendered willingly because he believed the power was worth any price. And he remembered the moment the Watcher had pulled that darkness out of him, the agony of separation from something that had become part of him, and the terrible clarity of being himself again without the corruption that had shaped his actions for years. The Watcher's intervention remains an open question. Catherine believed it was broken, that removing the corruption from Cornelius had severed the connection between the Ashford bloodline and the network of darkness that had sustained it. Thomas was less certain, believing that the capacity for corruption was not something that could be entirely removed, but only managed, requiring vigilance and moral choice in each generation. Modern historians who have examined the Ashford family records find them fascinating as documents of 19th century beliefs about the supernatural, regardless of whether the events described actually occurred as reported. The journals of Thomas and Catherine provide detailed accounts of family life in Virginia during a turbulent period, offering insights into the psychology of wealthy landowners, the dynamics of family dysfunction, and the ways in which guilt and secrecy affected every aspect of domestic life. Whether the Watcher was a genuine supernatural entity, a psychological phenomenon experienced by multiple family members due to shared trauma and suggestion, or something else entirely that defies simple categorization, the Ashford family's experience demonstrates how powerful such presences can be in shaping human behavior and family dynamics. The pattern of deaths and psychological destruction that accompanied the family's time at the manor is well documented, whatever its ultimate cause. The land where Ashford Manor once stood has changed significantly since the 1830s. The manor itself was destroyed by fire in 1892, the cause officially attributed to an electrical fault, though some local historians have suggested other explanations. The property has been subdivided multiple times, and today houses and small farms occupy the area where the Ashford plantation once stretched. The forest at the edge of the original property still exists, though it is smaller than it was in the 1830s, trimmed back by development over the decades. Local folklore in the area preserves memories of Ashford Manor and its dark history, though the stories have become increasingly embellished and unreliable over generations of retelling. Some versions include supernatural elements that are not present in the original family documents. Others have been sanitized, removing the darkest details and focusing on the family's tragedy as a cautionary tale about pride and ambition rather than a genuine account of supernatural encounters. The truth, as always with historical events viewed through the filter of time and oral tradition, lies somewhere between these extremes. Catherine Ashford's journals, the most detailed primary source for the family's experiences, disappeared from family possession in the early 1900s. Some fragments were preserved in letters and references in other documents, but the complete journals have never been located. Whether they were deliberately destroyed by family members who wanted to erase the family history, lost through ordinary neglect, or acquired by collectors of unusual historical documents, and kept in private collections, is unknown. Their absence means that the most detailed account of the Ashford family's encounters with the Watcher cannot be fully verified. What remains is a fragmentary but compelling picture of a family whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their understanding or control. Cornelius Ashford sought power and found darkness. His children paid the price for his choices in ways that no amount of wealth or social standing could prevent. And at the edge of a Virginia forest, something ancient and patient watched it all unfold, offering warnings that were too late for some and just in time for others.